When I remember the first kind of conversation sitting with Migrante and talking about, what are the things that we need to bring to the table at this convention? And one of them that was really loud right away was this idea of like, all day we've been talking and talking about stories and hearing the experiences, but we have a whole sector that's been built to support people and who are newcomers or immigrants or whatever. And when we got talking about undocumented folks and migrants and the barriers around funding to be able to support folks and how that creates a lot of pressure for people who work within the immigrant sector, for example. They can often get in trouble for the work that they do and can be forced to be exclusionary themselves, which could put a whole lot of pressure on a person's psyche. Anyway, I'm rambling, but this is kind of where our heads started going. And I was really excited to reconnect with Lisa de Gara, who works at Action for Healthy Communities. And we got to work closely with Lisa throughout COVID because our organizations came together and we're trying to help keep the curve down and keep people home and make sure people who are really vulnerable were supported. And Lisa, you were such an incredible force behind that movement. And I'm so excited that you kind of picked up the reins on this session and pulled it together. So I'll just invite you in here, and Jessica will bring us all in, and I'll just pass the floor over to you, Lisa. Thank you so much. And Adriana and Jereecah, thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that warm introduction. And I think it's clear in listening to the session, thank you very much to Hitomi, who's just finished. It's clear that this is an issue people feel incredibly passionately about, and with good reason. There are a lot of implications in the immigration space about policy, about service, and also about the experiences that individual families, people are having in this context, here in Alberta and then elsewhere in the country. What I was hoping that we could do for this session is I'll introduce myself, and then I'll have my two co-panelists introduce themselves. We know about their achievements, but it's always best when people get to speak on their own behalf. So I think that'll be great. So I'll introduce myself. I'll introduce my two co-panelists here, and then I have a short presentation, just a handful of slides, because what occurs to me in immigration spaces is that there's a lot of very complex, very detailed, and logistically meaningful context that people find themselves in. I think oftentimes we have an idea of what is a refugee and how have they come to be in this country, and that there's an expectation maybe that it's uniform for all different people or universal for all different people. And in our sector and in the work that we do, I think oftentimes not having good determination between what certain people are experiencing or not really colors their experience, and it has really significant implications. So I have two co-panelists with me here today. They were hand-selected because I like working with them, and I know that they are experts in this capacity. So I wanted to, I'll first introduce myself, and then I'll throw it to them. So my name is Lisa Jane de Gara. I do work at Action for Healthy Communities. I have the great pleasure of working, managing our rural program, so supporting immigrants and refugees that are outside of the greater Edmonton area, throughout central and eastern rural Alberta. So, I can rattle off all the different communities that we're in: Leduc, Beaumont, Camrose, Bulph and Riley and Tofield and Bashaw and Sedgwick, and Bonnyville and Cold Lake and Glendon and Lac La Biche and Wasetna and many more. Punoka, I guess we were last week. But that's not really the main issue here, because here we're going to be talking about a wide variety of issues. So I will start off. I'm going to throw to Jereecah Dela Cruz. Jereecah, would you care to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do every day.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Jereecah Dela Cruz, and I work at Action for Healthy Communities, specifically in the rural sector. So my specific role is a SWIS, also known as settlement worker in schools. So we serve families who are immigrants, refugees, and newcomers. I work closely right now with newcomer youth in the school settings. And just a little bit about myself, I immigrated to Canada when I was 11 years old, and I came from the Philippines. So looking forward to this discussion tonight, and thank you for having us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jereecah is also being modest. She failed to mention that she is an absolute powerhouse working with youth, and that she works with some of our youth who've had the hardest time connecting into the school system, and they all uniformly love her. So it's wonderful to have her on the team, and we're very glad that she can be here tonight. Adriana, would you care to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Lisa. I'm really thrilled to be here. I work for Central Alberta Community Legal Clinic. We're located in Red Deer, but we provide services on all Central Alberta, including Fort McMurray, Lethbridge. My role is I'm an immigration consultant, but I'm an advocate for the agency. We see hearings, detentions, anything related with immigrants. They don't have to have a status. We provide services for everybody just to provide them with that legal knowledge because sometimes they don't have the resources. Also, I'm an immigrant and I come from the perspective that I came as a foreign worker. So that's one of my passions. I always help people that they're struggling with workers, especially vulnerable workers. And we're going to touch on that later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both very much for being here. I'm going to see if I can get my slides. Well, we'll give this a moment to upload the file. If it uploads nicely, then we'll be in good spirits. Hold on. I think it will actually. I've got good optimism that this will work. Okay, it's uploading. So we're going to cross our fingers. While we do that, I will mention myself, I was born here in Canada. I've lived in a number of different provinces in Canada. But I think like many people who are here in Canada at the moment, my mother is Canadian and has a long time history in this country. My father is an immigrant. And my grandparents, my father's parents, were refugees. And I think those kinds of stories and histories, there we go, didn't that work beautifully? Those stories and histories of people's different relationships to citizenship, to different countries of origin, to different histories is a very important part, I think, of how things are done. So let's take a quick moment. Just as give a quick sense, we've done our introduction, fabulous. I wanted to run through a handful of definitions of different statuses that people hold here in Canada, because then when we work through the questions, I think it's important that we all have the same kind of working knowledge about what these terms mean. These will likely be familiar to many of you, but I wanted to make sure that we all had the same opportunity to discuss. So the first definition, again, it should be a reasonable one, is immigrant. And I think oftentimes we hear the term immigrant, we have kind of a colloquial definition and understanding of what an immigrant is. And the government of Canada, along with many other countries throughout the world, has a slightly different definition. So immigrants have chosen to leave their country, for example, to seek a different kind of life, maybe as a student, maybe as a worker, through all manner of different chosen pathways. But they have elected to leave their country of origin rather than being forced to leave their country of origin. And the important distinction in how the government of Canada identifies immigrants versus maybe how the average person on the street might identify immigrants is that the government of Canada believes an immigrant is someone who's been granted the right to live in Canada permanently by the relevant immigration authorities. So we might think, oh, a temporary foreign worker is an immigrant, an international student is an immigrant, they've come from somewhere else and they're opting to live here in Canada. But according to the government of Canada, someone becomes an immigrant when they are granted permanent residency, whether that's an economic permanent residency or a refugee status permanent residency. Until that time, they're living here in Canada, but they're not formally considered to be an immigrant, which is a really important distinction because it means that when we start having conversations about immigration, are we all really talking about the same thing? You've likely heard a lot of the discussion in the media recently about international students, about housing associated with international students, and then this comes on the heels of an immigration policy. Well, that's reasonable, of course, but are we all having the same conversation at the same time? Let me see if I can go to my next slide. I put this here. Immigrants attain the status of permanent resident, PR, and may seek to become naturalized, which is to say receiving their Canadian citizenship by choice later on in their life here in Canada. An interesting note, just based on the last conversation that we had, Canada has a distinction. There's a relatively small number of countries in the world that have a policy called juris soli, and it means the law of the soil. Essentially, that means that with very, very limited exceptions, if a person is born in Canada, they are by definition a Canadian citizen. There are many countries throughout the world where this is not the case. You can look through most of Western Europe, in Asia, in many countries as well. There's some variants throughout different regions in Africa. Latin America is almost exclusively juris soli as well. And so it's a really interesting component of how we think about immigration. In France, for example, or in the UK, it's not unheard of to have 3-4 generations of a family who have lived in a country and have never received citizenship. In Canada, citizenship is handed down to that the first people who are born in this country automatically. And I think that creates a really important context around how discourses around immigration, discourses around multiculturalism have kind of built up in this country. That's also true in the United States. It's not only true in Canada, but it is an important distinction here in Canada. Okay, so then we of course have refugees. Again, a term that's very familiar, very formally associated with the United Nations. The United Nations really helped to cement and solidify what our definition of refugee is. And we'll talk about the convention in a second. But refugees are people who have been forced from their home countries under threat of violence or harm. There's a lot of really interesting components. If someone is fortunate enough to be a refugee here in Canada, have that status here in Canada, there are a series of requirements that they have to abide by. One of which is that they are not permitted to return to their country of origin. And when you think about the nature of the Convention on Refugees, it makes sense because there's a presumption that if government is going to be protecting you from threat of harm and death, can you return to country of origin at any time on a temporary basis? In some respects, you can see the common sense logic. It can be a very difficult conversation that we need to have with families about, I understand that your mother in Eritrea is dying. I understand that you desperately want to go back to Ethiopia once more, before your life is over. But these are the conditions under which the status is granted here in this country. And that's also a fairly standard rule internationally. Refugee is a really interesting one because, again, it's a word that has an evocation associated with it. There's an emotional undertone. We've seen it in literature and in culture and in religion, in fact, long before it was formally defined. But our working definition comes from the 1951 Refugee Convention from the United Nations. Someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of political social group, political opinion, all different types. And so refugees are a cohort which, have been well established in Canada. We have an interesting kind of reality here in Canada, which is we have been accepting refugees from different communities for quite a long time, but we also only have a border with the United States. So the context around refugee arrivals in Canada is a very deliberate and a very intentional slate of arrivals by comparison with many other countries throughout the world that have contiguous borders with war zones, with conflict zones. And so the conversation that we have in this country necessarily is quite different. Again, this will probably be well versed to many of you who are here on the call, who are of course heavily invested, and thank you. But there've been a number of very prominent refugee waves to Canada. 1947 to 1952, displaced people came from Central and Eastern Europe, and at this time there were some who were victims of Nazism, who had experienced that at one point or another, and also people who were fleeing the increasing Soviet encroachment into Western Europe. It's not really a joke, but one of the dark comments in my household is my father's country, my grandparents' country of origin is Hungary, and so in 1944 they had to flee because of Nazism, and in 1956 they had to flee because of the encroachment of communism. So very, very unfortunate country geographically. But I actually had relatives who fled as refugees in both of those refugee waves. So it's not uncommon that a family might experience that over a long period of time or in a disrupted way. One of the most famous examples of refugee resettlement here in Canada is, of course, following the Vietnam War. 60,000 of the so-called boat people were able to settle in Canada, and this established things like the Group of Five refugee system, that a church or a community group or a family could opt to bring a refugee family over and support them. In 2016, the Syrians, 50,000 Syrians fled civil war and settled here in Canada. And then in 2021 and 2022, Canada committed to settling 40,000 Afghan refugees fleeing the Taliban after their return to power in August of 2021. I think we have almost hit that 40,000 Afghan refugees target just recently. It's been very administratively, logistically challenging, I believe, to have that. But of course, when you read this list, there's one example that many people would say, oh, well, there's a big refugee wave that's come just recently that's not included on this list. I'm not reading the chat, but, well, I am now reading the chat. If you're in the chat, is there a cohort that seems like maybe it should be on the list that is notably exempt, notably not listed? People are like, it's evening on a Sunday. Please don't make me do participation. Anybody from the comments? Anybody missing? Sometimes I'm also an instructor, a teacher, so I like to do a little bit of the prompting. Okay, well, give you 3, 2, 1. If you guessed Ukrainians, where are the Ukrainians on this list? You would be correct. One of the really unusual things, and this will be a big focus of our conversation to come, is the Ukrainians that have fled the recent war with Russia that have settled here in Canada. And there's about 225,000 Ukrainians who've come to Canada so far, and another 800,000 Ukrainians who have the right. Oh, there we go. See, people have written in. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Maybe there's a little time delay. There's 250,000 Ukrainians who've come to Canada so far, give or take, and there are about 800,000 additional Ukrainians who have the right to come to Canada who have not yet chosen to come. So the Ukrainians are in a weird spot. They have their own term. They're called evacuees. It's a unique term exclusive to the Ukrainian context here in Canada. The Ukrainians have left their home country under fear of war and death, and that part is not contested. But the Ukrainians in this case are not considered to be formal refugees. They are evacuees. They have been awarded by the government of Canada a limited term that they're allowed to live and work here in Canada under the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel. You might hear this called the QIT or sometimes called the SWIT. I think it would have been better if we'd kind of settled on a standard pronunciation, but whatever, that horse is bolted. In any event, the Ukrainians are here under this unusual kind of a pathway, which actually doesn't afford them the ability to remain in Canada indefinitely. Now, you may be wondering, well, the war started in early 2022. Some of the Ukrainians were here as recently as May of 2022. What's going to happen 3 years after that? And to that, I would say, a great question. Honestly, there's not really a straightforward plan at this time. And it's something that is a significant anxiety, both for providers in the sector and also for families themselves who don't necessarily know what's going to happen to them long term. A lot of what we're going to be talking about here, and of course, a term that people should be very aware of, is asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are people who have left their country of origin and are seeking protection in another country, but they haven't yet been legally recognized as a refugee, and they're waiting to receive a decision. So essentially, they have approached another country asking for protection, but their status has not yet been determined sufficiently that they can be confirmed as a refugee or ultimately refused as a refugee. In Canada, I made these slides a little while ago, and I've sort of refined them over time. Originally, most asylum seekers that were entering Canada were coming across our land border with the United States. And at the time, especially from 2016 until mid-2023, there was a very substantial land border at Roxham Road in Quebec, so Quebec and northern Vermont in the United States, where there were 29,000 asylum seeker crossings in 2022 alone. Oh, there we go. The number of asylum seekers has fluctuated over time. It used to be Canada actually had relatively few border crossing asylum seekers. The biggest reason why there was such a huge jump was in 2017, 2018, following policy changes by then US President Donald Trump, it forbade asylum seeking in the United States. Now, this is considered widely illegal under international law. There was understandably a lot of frustration, a lot of public discourse about it. But at the time, it influenced the way that people were thinking about asylum seeking and the decisions that they made. So Canada suddenly had far more asylum seekers than historically we'd ever really had, and presenting in different ways than we'd ever seen before. Essentially, asylum seekers present, if they're at a border, it's a bit different, but here in Alberta, most often they present at an airport. They essentially arrive from their country of origin and say, I would like to seek the protection of the government. They enter a system for review. So most often they have an interview. Interview goes on. We've had a couple clients where it's gone on 8-9 hours. That's fairly typical, like a full day of questioning. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. After that interview, if the interviewer, who's usually a border officer, has determined that there's sufficient evidence that they could perhaps make a claim, then they're entered into a queue to be considered for asylum. That's a court process that's processed in this country by IRB. And IRB basically reads the evidence about a family's case, the threat of harm in their home country, the evidence, the details, and then determines ultimately, will they be allowed to stay in Canada indefinitely as a refugee, or will they be returned to their country of origin, not having made sufficient claim to be a refugee? This is a really stressful process. I'm going to give my panelists the opportunity to talk about in a moment what that has looked like. But I mention this because asylum seekers are they're a really meaningful challenge for systems to make sure that they can be appropriately accommodated during the time that they're waiting in Canada. Those wait times for processing often take as long as 3 years. So for 3 years, we have families who would like to be considered refugees who are waiting. And they have very limited capacity to access social The two other categories that I'll touch on just briefly, because I think there's a lot to be said about that as well, are temporary foreign workers. We often call them by their acronym, TFWs. I know there's been a lot of good discussion about those earlier today. Sometimes they're called work permit holders or visa holders, or sometimes just temporary residents without the working part included. The original planning associated with the temporary foreign workers program was a seasonal agricultural labor program. It began in the mid-20th century. Relationships, especially between skilled workers in the Caribbean and agricultural producers in southern Ontario and to a lesser extent southern British Columbia. Agricultural workers would come to Canada for a handful of months. They would work. They would be paid higher wages than they would equivalently be paid in their country of origin. They would return home, and the cycle would repeat in the following year. This still happens, but what we notice now is that there's a larger percentage of temporary foreign workers who are working in full-time, full-year positions, most often, at least in Alberta, in minimum wage jobs. Gas stations, we see a lot of clients who work at gas stations, who are working in restaurants, who are working in fast food restaurants. Unfortunately, they're very vulnerable to exploitation for some reasons that we're going to discuss as a panel. And one of the unusual things that started to happen increasingly often is that those minimum wage workers who are working in those roles here in Canada are now increasingly able to bring their children on visas. So we have children who are under the age of 18 who are enrolled in K-12 publicly funded schools, and their parents have come from internationally and are working as temporary foreign workers, often in some very distressing and very exploitative circumstances. Final thing that I'll add on my presentation is international students. There's been a lot of discussion about international students in the media, especially in major cities and a lot of college towns throughout the country. At the moment, Canada has, I believe, about 750,000 international students. We have about 1 million temporary foreign workers who are working in the country at the moment. And yet the number that you continue to hear in media when we talk about immigration is 500,000 new permanent residents. And that is still true, but we have permanent residents, international students, and temporary foreign workers who are all creating a composition of who's arriving into the country and what they happen to need. Many international students are enrolled in colleges and universities. They're paying international tuition fees. They're adults. But we are also seeing an increasing proportion of children in the K-12 public school system who are enrolled in conventional K-12 schools, and they have some interesting needs associated with their work as well. So that's a real whip round of all the definitions associated with all different cohorts. And there's things that I've left off because they're more fringe cases, but those are really the majority of the cohort that we happen to see. And so I will now throw it to my panelists because y'all have heard enough from me. They're like, this lady, this is too much. I'll throw it over to my panelists. Specifically, let's start by hearing about asylum seekers. Now, I know that both of my co-panelists have had some really intense experiences in supporting asylum seekers. So I'll first put the question to Jereecah. Where have we encountered asylum seekers, and what are their needs typically when we first meet them?
Okay, so specifically with my role, because I am situated in schools and also the community as well, some of the places that we've encountered asylum seeker families and students are places like community that they're settling in, and also the school settings as well. And because I work in Leduc and Beaumont area, we're very close to the airport. So we've gotten calls from different service providers as well for families and supports for asylum seekers. So typically when we encounter asylum seekers, there are a number of things that they need, but usually it's interpreters if there's no interpreters available at the airport at the moment. And also typically they will be in the airport for a while, and we find that they only have what they have that they brought from their countries, which are just their clothes. And usually they're very hungry and needs some shelter as well. So they're kind of like in that very first moment of entry, and they don't really know what to do just yet because usually they don't speak the language. So there's a big language barrier. So knowing what to do next after entering, it's a big question for a lot of them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Addie, where do you tend to encounter asylum seekers?
For me, it's a little bit different because they come once they settle. So I see a lot of people, they enter as visitors, and then after a couple months or a year, they like Canada and they decide to apply for refugee. The ones that I do see that they are immediate need, we tend to refer them with other agencies that they can provide services for that. But like you mentioned before, it's really hard if they have not gone to that interview and obtained the refugee claimant document, because but here I'm located in Red Deer. So here, if you don't have that document, no agency will touch you. I know other provinces, Quebec, they even receive income support without the document, just the file that they have confirmation that they filed for refugee. But it's very difficult to explain to people that the process can take years. But I don't know, word of mouth. My clients, they always say a friend of a friend told me that you guys help with this, and they find us. I don't find them. Yeah.
And thank you for that. And I think that kind of leads us really nicely into that next question about misconceptions maybe that asylum seekers or prospective asylum seekers have about Canada. One of the things I wanted to mention is that I will often get the phone call. We technically have an agency that we do referrals to who has the ability to more substantially support asylum seekers. So we are encountering asylum seekers and then conducting referrals accordingly. But one of the things that I always hear, I get the telephone call from the airport, from the homeless shelter very frequently, from a food bank, and they always say, I've got a family of refugees here and they need some help. And I say, are you sure they're refugees? Are you sure they're not asylum seekers? And they say, I don't understand what that means. You need to help me right away. And so I think that's an important distinction. But aside from our definition, our variation in understanding, people divided by a common tongue, maybe Addie, what kind of misconceptions do people seem to have about this asylum process and what that looks like for them?
A lot of the things that I have seen lately is that they come in a group, but for me, sometimes just like one person shows up. And then we see the wave of people they know after a couple months. And then they have to understand, like I said, that this process and how we take clients, how you refer clients. So they will share stories, or they will say, oh, like my friend is in Quebec and he's receiving income support, therefore me too. Or they go and claim in other provinces refugee, and they move to Alberta because they start talking to other people. They hear that in Alberta there's a lot of money, that the government will pay you even for going to school, when that's not the case. And I see clients that sometimes they have to go for a misrepresentation hearing or admissibility hearings because they have claimed the status in another province and they receive income support, and they never report that they transition to another province.
Absolutely. And it presents it's a real challenge because, as you've mentioned, the services that are available to asylum seekers are not identical across the country. And yet, obviously, we're a country that has, full and meaningful mobility. So how do people kind of navigate? Jereecah, I'd be curious to hear what you observe in terms of asylum seeker children, especially the ones that we encounter in those rural K-12 schools.
In terms of like the rural sector with children, a lot of the problem with the students coming into the school is, of course, again, one of the biggest ones is language barrier, where, kids that are coming through are very young. And so when they come through the school and navigate the system, oftentimes they're very lost because they've just left their country, the country that they came from, where they grew up, and then now they have to transition into a whole different system, a whole different education and classmates and teachers, where we often see a lot of those students become very anxious and oftentimes don't talk either because they feel that I don't know English and my English is very broken. So I'd rather just not participate. So we see a lot of that case in the school sector.
Absolutely. And maybe a question, because I know people always ask me this question, so I'll ask you the same question. We are supporting rural schools. Why is it that asylum seeker families are finding themselves in communities in rural Alberta, 200 kilometers from the city, 300 kilometers from the city, very, very small towns and villages? What is it that brings them there?
You know what? We ask the same question all the time. And oftentimes, a lot of the asylum seeker families are not really briefed on the community that they could be landing in. And so sometimes when they do land in those communities where limited supports are available, and they have nobody to speak with, or oftentimes they have to go to Edmonton to seek those services. There's a number of reasons for that. Sometimes, it's friends and families where they tell you to go to Alberta, but they don't really tell you where. Like, where in Alberta? Alberta is really big. And oftentimes when they do that onboarding as well, when they were at the airport, they're also not told that information where, hey, maybe you should go to Edmonton because there's more available supports in Edmonton rather than going to the smaller towns where supports are limited. But in Edmonton, it's you have a lot more opportunities.
Absolutely. I think it's something that in rural work, we also observe that people settling into small communities, maybe where the services, they're not aware of the services that do or don't exist. But Addie, I'll throw to you.
Well, to me, it's on the contrary. I have a lot of people that they move because they said that they're tailor the services for them. And then there's a lot of community. So like in bigger cities, like they tend to dismiss them based on the services that they need. And in small communities, they come together, like the whole town comes together. They put together hampers, blankets, they drive people to services, to appointments. And that's what a lot of people have mentioned to me. I like that because it's a small community. We need something or it's an emergency. They have somebody to rely on. Where in big cities or here, it is not for lack of effort of the government. I'm going to say that. Like right now, we're struggling, our food bank is struggling with donations. So yes, you can have a hamper, but it might take a couple days when they need something right away. And we are limited to the scope of work that we do. So sometimes I can send an email, but no, I cannot drive you, or no, it's like you say, based on funding, sometimes we're very limited or what we do for the clients. And I think a smaller community, even though they're distant for services in the city, they have a bigger support.
Absolutely. I think both of those are really important and meaningful observations. We have a number of clients who are settled in Camrose, some as Group of 5 refugees and some as asylum seekers. And part of the reason why they really want to remain in Camrose is that the community has a long history of supporting refugees, has a very well-established church network that does a lot of support for refugees. One of the other things that I would also mention, I've noticed this acutely in the context of Ukrainian evacuees, and to a lesser extent in more asylum seeker cases, is availability of free housing. As has been articulated a number of times, when people are asylum seekers in this country, they have a very, very limited slate of services that they're allowed to access until such time as their claim is actually heard. So it might be 3 years. Asylum seekers are able to get a work permit, but it might, it's going to be 3 years in all likelihood before they have a formal decision one way or the other. So we often hear about families who heard from a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend on WhatsApp that there's a house that's next to another house in, Drayton Valley or Toefield or something where maybe I can get free housing for 6 months in exchange for looking after the horses. And what's interesting in those cases is that those will continue to present. We have had a lot of observations, especially from our Ukrainian clients, who said, I lived in a village in Ukraine, but the village in Ukraine had a train that could take you to the city, and it also had a nightclub. So our vision of rural in Alberta and in Canada more generally, I think is a really major stumbling block for a lot of our clients, and that's something that we see. We've got actually just some interesting comments from the chat, which I'm just going to touch on because I think it's very relevant. Very differing perspectives on urban versus rural Alberta. I feel the rural communities helping more is due to the kindness of the individual members of society there, and supports within the urban areas are nonprofit or government facilitated. And to the commenter, I don't want to blow up your spot, but you can read the comments as well. I would completely agree. I think that what we observe in rural networks generally is that there's a need to have an interconnectedness of networks. We are often relying not just on an entity, not on a system, not on an organization. We're relying on like Linda and Brenda and Stephanie and maybe Mark. Those are the people who are doing a lot of the actual work that we require for those people to get what they need. So thank you for that. I have another slate of questions, but maybe before we go on from there, in both of your observations, what is kind of the most critical gap that you observe with asylum seekers? What is the thing that most often you observe that they really, really acutely need the most, and it's just not available? Maybe Addie, I'll start with you.
I think information. Something simple like when somebody's at the airport, I think the agents are dismissive, that you just like give them the forms, sign it, and then they don't explain what will be the prescription if they decide to cancel the refugee application, or if because they potentially can be, once they give you a decision at the first stage, you have a deportation order, like you have to leave, and sometimes they don't explain that to them. So I think information, it's really important, and it's a huge gap they do not.
Absolutely. And Jereecah, what do you think is the most pressing gap that we observe?
I think just to add to what Addie just said about information, legal literacy programs, where I think to implement legal literacy programs that help refugee claimants understand just the intricacy of like asylum process, because it's rigorous process. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not easy breezy. So this can like include workshops, seminars, or informal sessions that are conducted by legal professionals or even organizations that specializes in refugee rights, that could do these presentations to them and give these information out.
Absolutely. I think those are both like essential suggestions. I think what we observe with asylum seekers is that there's just a very poor continuity of information, either that is being delivered, but it's not delivered in a way that people can really receive, or there are pieces of this that need to be articulated much more specifically. I would also put, because I think it builds into this wider discussion around misconceptions, is the type of language that's used in the media and in communities. For example, in the summertime, you probably would have seen the story on CBC about a number of asylum seekers that were in Toronto just sleeping in the street. Like there was no availability of shelters in the city of Toronto. And so many asylum seekers were sleeping in the street. Some local churches got involved and provided them with temporary shelter. But it was very unnerving to watch discussion about how is Toronto going to manage this influx of refugees. Because if you are talking about refugees and people have an idea in the back of their mind about the services that refugees receive and the supports that they receive, you end up in a very politically incongruous context where people are saying refugees are entitled to income support, they're entitled to housing, they're entitled to all these things. Why are they sleeping in the street if that's the case? And so I've observed this with asylum seekers really acutely with the Ukrainians as well, because it just really is as though they're refugees, but they're technically not refugees. And that differentiation in language makes things incredibly difficult. I think that our ability to be specific in language, it wouldn't necessarily help the claimants, but it maybe would help society to understand a little bit better. I'm gonna take this one as well from the chat. See, now everybody's warmed up. They're ready to discuss. I'll read this one out. The lack of answering questions is the greatest disempowerment. If we implemented a system that attached a ticket number to every single question and built accountability and advocacy system around answering questions thoroughly, voted by the one who asked, it could make education central to human rights cases. Knowledge is power. I agree. I like that idea of kind of having a digital intervention system. Mark, you might have a look at there's one of the things in the current call for proposals about digital informations and improving digital information systems that are associated with the Government of Canada. It's quite a process applying for those CFP. I feel like my brain is falling out of my ears working on it right now, but it's a good idea. So it might be one that's worth flagging. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit as well about temporary foreign workers, because realistically, in all of our work, we do see asylum seekers. It's not infrequent that we see asylum seekers, but we see many more temporary foreign workers. One of the interesting peculiarities of the Settlement Workers in Schools program is that we support a lot of children and their families who are not permanent residents. Most settlement services are only intended to support permanent residents. Settlement Workers in Schools has a little bit more of an acknowledgement of like, if a child is in school, you can deliver direct services. I'm curious to hear a little bit from both of you about where do we find temporary foreign workers in community? What is our experience of finding them in community? So maybe Jereecah, I'll start with you. We get a phone call. It's a temporary foreign worker family. Who are they? What's the story?
TFWs, normally you find them, to be honest, almost everywhere. But specifically, they're in different sectors in various industries. So, like healthcare, caregiving, and domestic work is very popular. Retail services as well, and hospitality and tourism. So, a lot of them are in hotels as workers. And also, when we do get a call, often comes from the community providers or even schools as well, that a TFW parents have a child in the school system. So that's what often we get that kind of request.
Excellent, thank you. And Addie, where do you encounter TFWs in your practice?
Often our government wants to be welcoming and inclusive, but they come with policies that I don't think they plan ahead of the policy. For example, I have a lot of people that they have family as visitors, and then we had that policy with visitors can apply for an for a work permit during COVID. So that was because shortage of medical care. And they extended. So a lot of people, they're here, but they don't plan. They just think that they can have a job within 2 weeks, and then they sold their house, vehicles, and they don't plan ahead. Sadly, I see a lot of people that have been exploited. So I'll say 80% of the temporary foreign workers that I have seen, they encounter abuse. So restaurant, meat plants, sometimes they even they arrive at the airport with an open work permit after they talk to Canada Border Service agents, and they're like, they never came to pick me up, and now I'm in a hotel. I don't know what to do. It's a sad story because people always come to Canada and they think, oh, Canada is amazing. It's kind of like the American dream, right? They think we're better. And no, that's not the case. A lot of people, they don't understand that when they came to work to a company, it's a closed work permit. And if they're exploited, there's a process. And our government, despite that person is being abused or was in a vulnerable situation, a new work permit can take up to 3 months. And that's another thing that I don't think the government takes into consideration, that there has to be faster processing for people that are in this situation, or plan ahead. Just plan B in case there's something like this happen. But no, there's not accountability in our government to just say, yeah, this person is eligible, you have to wait 3 months.
Absolutely. No, I think we see a lot of exactly that. As was alluded to, when temporary foreign workers come into this country, most of them come on a closed work permit where they can only work for one particular employer. And so if you think about a recipe for exploitation, telling someone that they've just landed in a new country, they have very limited connections to anyone, they're most often working in a low-wage job, and then they're not even allowed to work for anybody else unless they undergo a lengthy government process. It has audits. It takes quite a long time. As Addie said, it can take several months. You can imagine that that's a really significant recipe for exploitation. In my team and I's work, we've seen a number of cases that I would qualify as bone chilling, to be honest, because we encounter this exact issue of, if you have an employer that you're the only person you're legally allowed to work for is that employer, and you are legally only supposed to work 40 hours a week, and your employer comes in and says, hey, it's been really great having you here. Just, the deep fryers really do need an extra clean so we can keep making money in this restaurant. And I know you're over for your hours, but it would be a real shame if this work didn't get done. So you're probably just going to do it, right? And we encounter this pervasively. This is an absolutely constant and ongoing issue. There's a question that's been put in the chat, which I think is a great one, and I will share my perspective on it once the two of you have had the chance to ask. So the question is, what are your thoughts on temporary foreign workers and their impact on the Canadian economy and job market? Now, I have a bunch of thoughts on this, but I'll throw it to Addie first, and then Jereecah. We can talk about what's the economic impact.
Well, I'm biased because I came as a temporary foreign worker, and I can say that a lot of the jobs, Canadians would not do the job. So, like you say, we came. A lot of people were highly educated. We have bachelor's degree, PH, but it's because of the accent, and we just want to try new things, or because you just want actually to be better for you and your family and pick a new opportunity, just move to Canada. It's really great if the work is actually regulated. There's always open space for everybody to be productive and then put something into the market. But I feel that a lot of temporary foreign workers, they just come with hopes and they put their soul into that work, and sometimes they get abused. If it's great for the economy when they're actually paying their taxes, they're contributing by bringing family members and then transitioning to permanent residency and Canadian citizenship. A lot of the people, they work seasonal. I feel it's a little bit of exploitation because they come every year, they work hard, and they will never transition. It's very rare when you see the seasonal workers transition. But everybody that comes to Canada as a temporary foreign worker, they have that dream that they want to like settle eventually. And not all of occupation are eligible to become permanent residents.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And how about you, Jereecah?
I would also say that I'm a bit biased on that because my mom came to Canada as a temporary foreign worker as well in the 2000s. So that was a while back. But for the most part, all the clients that I've worked with as TFWs, I've encountered a lot of very hard worker TFWs where they will work. They will work if you give them work. And a lot of the TFWs will not say no to any work because these are the jobs that they need, and a lot of them do send money back home as well. So whatever work is available, they will do that. And I think TFWs contribute to economic growth by supporting industries like agriculture. So they are the ones that would be planting and harvesting crops and ensuring that we have food supplies. And we have a lot of TFWs in that line where they will do that specific job where no one else would want to do it. But if they come in and they're approved and it's regulated, they will do that job. So, TFWs, in my experience, they're all very hard worker people, and they would be happy to do the job if they were given to.
Absolutely. I think my sense is quite similar, and my biggest concern, as has been mentioned, is not the nature of people doing work. It's really much more about how the realities of this system are being communicated to people who are participating in this work. So are they being given an appropriate acknowledgement of what it would require to become a permanent resident if that's desired, which is true in an overwhelming majority of the cases that we encounter. Most temporary foreign workers that we encounter would like to be permanent residents. Do people have an honest understanding, or do people have a meaningful understanding of what their labor rights are in this province and in this country? Because one of the things that we find the most disturbing is these are people who have come with a vision of working, with a vision of getting competitively higher wages than they would in their country of origin. And yet some of them are not even getting paid. In one of the cases that we had, there was a father and son duo who were working in a restaurant, and they hadn't been paid for, I think, 3 months when we first met them, because the owner of the restaurant basically said, oh, first it was your training wages, and secondly, it was that I'm providing you with a place to stay because you get to live in the attached hotel. So I don't really have to pay you because I'm already looking after you. And when you start hearing stories like that, it has evocations. Like, I would think, policies is my former work background. I start thinking about those company towns that you used to hear about in the coal mines of West Virginia, where people would work as a coal miner, and then they would pay rent to the coal mine to live at the coal mine, and then they would have to buy all their essential items from the coal mine store, so that every part of the person's economic life gets tied back to the employer and not to the capacity of that person to actually have a meaningful and generative and like free economic experience here in Canada. It's one of the things where I think realistically, in a well-regulated, well-monitored system, I think it could work beautifully. At the moment, I think that there are some really, really serious challenges with the temporary foreign worker system, and that makes it hard to kind of endorse it as an idea. I think people, it's not that people are unwilling to work hard, because it's clear that they're willing to work hard. But do we have a system that sufficiently protects their rights and sufficiently ensures that they have a dignified working experience here in Canada? Because ultimately, I think that's our number one priority. So yeah, I mean, we could talk for a long time about it. We could start, going into Keynesian economics and all that, but I don't think that's the focus of this evening. I want to ask one question, actually, because I know that it's a big challenge that we have for a number of reasons, about children accompanying temporary foreign worker parents, because we see this really, really frequently, and it does present some real challenges. So maybe I'll start with you, Addie. Do you tend to see kids under 18 in your work, and what does that tend to look like?
Well, the policy the government announced, they announced it's going to be in 3 phases. So not all of the temporary foreign workers, they qualify to bring the family right away. Right now is like higher position, supervisors. I've seen a lot of foreign workers that they don't meet the requirements, but they were like, oh yeah, like we can wait for the policy. So the family comes as a visitors, and then we see a lot of, I have probably 8 that they have teenagers that they're transitioning to 18. So we have to apply for a temporary permanent resident permit, just because they fall under the cracks of the policy. So they're adults, but they're dependents, and it's very hard to obtain an open work permit for them, justifying that they're accompanying family as a foreign workers. Minors, one of the struggles that I have is that when they come as visitors, people don't understand that they can sometimes, the schools let the kid be enrolled, but I have a couple where like the kids were sick and they have to go to the street clinic because the government was like, nope, they cannot have access to medical care. So I see those flaws on the government, but also, like, once again, I think is information, misleading information, where the government announced this, but they have to explain, this is phase 1, this is who can apply, this is who cannot apply. So temporary foreign workers, they take that into consideration when they try to bring their family.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And that case about admission or non-admission into K-12 schools is something that we see quite often, and that is often a big concern. So if somebody is here in the country on a visitor visa with the hope of getting a student visa, how can we be like, what happens to them if they require emergency medical care in that intervening period? Because sometimes that intervening period is 6 to 12 months. And if that's the case, how can we be assured of the fact that those kids get the safety that they need? So thank you for that. Jereecah, how about you?
Sorry, it was my unmute button was not working for some time. I would say for TFWs and like their statuses and visitor visa, we've actually had just an example where there was a family who came into to Canada hoping to enroll their children to school as visitor visa, but the school said no, because they are under that visitor visa status, so they are not allowed to come into the school because of that specific status. Because if you're going to be here as a visitor visa, why are you coming into schools? So a lot of that misconceptions where a friend of mine was able to actually enroll. The family told us that a friend of theirs was able to enroll into a different school division, and the school division has allowed it to happen. So sometimes it really varies on different communities of what information is put out there, and also even school divisions, because some school division will say yes, some school division will say absolutely not, you cannot. So a lot of families and parents are confused about these information where one side said yes, one side said no. And so coming back to that family, they came here for about 3 weeks, and then they went back home. And there was 6 of them in the family. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of, tickets are expensive right now, but they ended up going back home after finding out that information.
Absolutely. I think, these are, it's really important, I think, for all of us to reflect exactly on these cases where people fall through the cracks. I think we have a complex system of statuses that people can have, of different contexts that people have come through. And what we notice certainly is that this is not information at the school level and at the school division level that they always even necessarily feel comfortable with. We have a good collaborative relationship with many of the school divisions that we work with, and they will often ask, can I admit this student? What do you think? And I think it's a really, on the one hand, I'm glad that they value our opinion and our perspective as much as they do. That's, much appreciated. But that to me speaks to a much bigger issue around, we're looking at, can children be admitted to school? Yes or no? Who's in charge of that decision? What paperwork needs to be expedited? What if it, because I think for most Canadians, if somebody said, well, the kid won't be allowed to go to school for 2 weeks, because it'll take about that long to get the paperwork sorted out, people would probably say, that's okay. But if it takes 6 months, if it takes 9 months, then suddenly it becomes a very different risk calculus around how long are we willing to deny a child admission into school because of a bureaucratic issue? And this is something, interestingly, I think we often kind of pat ourselves on the back by comparison with our American equivalents, especially on the immigration system. But in part because of how immigration has evolved in the United States, this was something that they had to hash out nationally. And now there are national protocols on children who do not have residency being able to attend K-12 schools in the United States. And they said, yes, they are. And so when I think about how asylum seekers and temporary foreign workers and those conditions are changing in this country, I think that we might be headed for a conversation like that, where we have to say, what nationally and provincially, of course, because we're so federalized, what values do we have that we want to reflect in policy? How do we ensure that policy is responsive enough that when someone comes in, like the case that Jereecah and I encountered in, what was it, October, November, I guess, when we have cases like that, what can we do and how can we be sure that a standard list of rules is followed so that it's not at the discretion of a high school principal or a school secretary whether or not somebody gets admitted into school or not? So those are a lot of the concerns that I see. There's also a lot of concern around children's ability to access disability services. In Alberta, at least, I don't know that it's true across the country, but in Alberta, you need to have permanent residency in order to access most disability services. And so if a family comes with a child with a disability, seeking permanent residency becomes even more urgent than it did before. And in the case of our Ukrainians, people are fleeing war. So they didn't necessarily contemplate having all these documents, with them ahead of time. But then we have children with some with fairly severe disabilities who are not able to get access to systems that other children are able to, simply on a basis of their immigration status. And so those are things that they rattle in my brain, and it's troubling. And I think some of it is just that there needs to be more of a discussion around how people are landing and what that looks like and what that has meant for them.
Also, I want to mention that people want to be helpful. I had a couple times where Canadians, we have one refugee seeker that the son had Down syndrome, and then he was concerned because he received a letter saying that the family is going to be inadmissible based on the services that this kid was going to need. And a Canadian was willing to be the guardian. And I was like, do you understand the result of that? And they were like, oh yeah, once we pass that to him, and then once we become permanent residents, he can give the kid back. And I was like, no, morally I cannot do that. And then also I have to talk to a family lawyer, set up an appointment so they can understand. So a lot of people, sometimes they want to be helpful, or I see that a lot in schools as well, where the school is like, oh, do you have a cousin or a family member? And then they can be guardian and we can enroll them in school. And I'm like, no, you cannot do that. But I do see those cases. So something in place to avoid that and make them understand what will be the responsibilities of becoming a guardian. Because sometimes people just want to be helpful, but they don't want to take the responsibility of taking a kid.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask a question because I think this was put into the chat, and I think it's something we haven't really touched on yet, but it is a favorite subject of mine, which is concerning recruitment agencies Not all immigration consultants, obviously, because we've got a lovely one on the call with us right now. But I'm curious to hear about experiences with people who are exploiting the immigration consultant system, especially when it comes to temporary foreign workers. Maybe, Addie, what does that tend to look like? And then we can talk a little bit about what the consequences of that are.
It's very hard because I think we had a bad fame compared to lawyers, immigration lawyers. Like we were the bad child that nobody wants. A lot of them, now that they became the college, the immigration consultants, they start promoting more regulations. You can complain, and we have to be more accountable for our actions. They still have a little bit of flaws where you can have representatives that can assist you with your immigration matters outside of Canada, or you can become an immigration consultant outside of Canada. A lot of the things that I have seen lately, people exploited from India and Morocco lately. We have almost like 120 people that were exploited from Morocco. It was from an agent outside of Canada. So Canada Board Service agents, they can come, they can do an interview, but it's very hard to prosecute somebody outside of Canada, so we cannot. Also, while in Canada, our CMP and Canada Board Service agents, they have their own division. It can take years to build a case to prosecute somebody, but also because they go after an entity, not they have to be specific charges against that person. So if that person committed a crime, they can put them into jail. But it's really bad because I can see where people, they go to jail for 2-3 years, so they will reopen a business with a new name, and then they take advantage of foreign workers or people with the dream coming to Canada. But we're working on build a good reputation. I always encourage people that they use my services of a lawyer. They can look at directory, either or a lawyer or an immigration consultant. And I say if they're not licensed, they're not appear with the name, the number, then avoid them. Also check when you're signing your retainer, you have to see the payments, how much they're charging. Try to talk to other people. Just don't go with the first one. There's ways that you can avoid a little bit, I'll say, because sometimes word of mouth, they always say, oh, my friend told me about this person. And when they come to me, most of the times they don't have money, which for me doesn't really matter. We work pro bono basis, but it's really sad when we see people desperate, and sometimes there's nothing that we can do by the time that they come to us, and it's heartbreaking that we have to explain. Yes, you can stay in Canada, but you're going to be in limbo for 3 months, or you have the option to go back home.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting observation, and I think we have seen a lot of that, of people who are paying outrageous sums to people outside of the country on an immigration consultancy basis. I think the worst one that we've seen recently was $60,000 for an LMIA in Red Deer, interestingly, for a job that did not exist. So it was just pure fraud, essentially, that somebody was paying $60,000 for the assurance that there would be a job waiting for them when they got to Canada. And the job never existed to begin with. So they sold their house and they ended up in Red Deer, and the situation continues. But Jereecah, I'd like to hear from you what we've seen in terms of those maybe unscrupulous, not all, but the unscrupulous immigration consultants, and what that has tended to look like for our clients.
We have this thing in our team where how much have you seen in fees for immigration consultant? Who has the highest? Because Lisa mentioned our highest is actually $60,000. Another client in Leduc, they came from Vietnam, and we were asking why $60,000? What was included in the services? And our client was saying, oh, it's like a package deal where if we have any problems with LMIA, they will help us. And also it was including if we needed to talk to them, they will help us. So it's a whole package deal. That's why it cost that much. And there was 4 people in their family as well. So we were saying, it's like, it shouldn't cost that much. It shouldn't be $60,000 to be just talking to an immigration consultant right after applying for an LMIA. And a lot of these families, often they will sell everything back home so that they can afford immigration consultants and also to process the whole paper because they can't do it on their own. So, and not a lot of them would know what is the right fee, what is the fee that is supposed to be charged. So we've seen $60,000, we've seen $30,000 USD as well. So we've seen a whole bunch of different fees that have been applied. And when the parents come here, they often have very little to no money. So they have to work right away. And sometimes even when they come here, their LMIA job is not available just yet. So they have to wait. And even then, that puts a big strain on the family because financially they have nothing anymore because they've sold everything and they've paid for the fees for an immigration consultant. So it affects our families negatively in the financial side.
I think that's a really good observation, and I realize as we've said it, we didn't get one thing in my jargon list, which is that LMIA. So LMIA stands for a labor market impact assessment. In theory, I say in theory because I don't think it's being done this way very often. In theory, it used to be that a Canadian employer would have to say, I have a job, whatever, cashier at Tim Hortons. I have posted this job on Indeed. I've posted it on LinkedIn. I've posted it here, there, and everywhere. It's been in 100 places. I didn't get a single applicant from anybody in this country who could do the job of being the cashier at Tim Hortons. And as a result, Government of Canada, I would like permission to hire a worker from overseas to come and work here in Canada. Now, again, I stress that this was in theory because in practice, we see that oftentimes what unscrupulous consultants will do is that they're playing both ends of the deal. So they're saying to the family, I can get you a job at Tim Hortons. And they're saying to a manager at a Tim Hortons, I'll give you 20 grand if you hold this job for this person that I'm bringing in from overseas. And so what we end up in is a lengthy chain, a complex and lengthy economic chain of a family that really wants to come to Canada, a consultant, not all, in this case, an unscrupulous consultant who really wants to make a tremendous sum of money, and somebody who has a minimum wage job. They would like to, ideally get a little bit of extra money on the back end on the hiring process. And what I've observed as we encounter these cases, whether it's financial abuse or physical abuse, non-payment, all sorts of issues, is that it is a very challenging thing, as Addie mentioned, to really nail down people who are engaging in these behaviors, because that middleman who's paying the Tim Hortons and making a deal with the family may never come to Canada at all. Sometimes they're called ghost consultants. They're kind of like hazy and in the ether, but it's also a big challenge. These are people who have slick, nice looking websites, oftentimes that are more intended to be more easy and user friendly or more commercially appealing than the honest brokers. And so we see this all the time. It is a constant and ongoing challenge that we see, again, as an organization that's not even really supposed to be supporting temporary foreign workers at all, but it is constant. So.
I also want to mention that one of the things that I see is cultural, where when I see people coming to Canada and they start working and they come to me and they're like, oh, you know what, I'm struggling. I still have to pay like $5,000 to this agent back in, I don't know, like the States or India. And I'm like, no, you don't. You don't have to pay that. They're like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm going to be in jail when I go back home. So it's very difficult to explain that you don't have to pay a ghost consultant or somebody that you sign because it's illegal. And it takes time sometimes to people to understand that that's not allowed, but I feel it's cultural.
It's a huge issue, and I think we see that really, really consistently. So one of the things I wanted to put, this was also put in the chat, and I think it's a terrific question. If you had the opportunity to make a recommendation about whether it's the asylum seekers, actually we can do it maybe in sequence. If you had a recommendation about a policy change that would really make a difference for temporary foreign workers, let's say, what would be the thing that you would want to see change? What would be your recommendation?
My recommendation will be salary-based wages, like all across, probably for foreign workers. At least not the minimum, because we know the provinces changes. But something that is entitled, like, so they can afford food here and at the same time send money back home.
Excellent. Jereecah, what would be your recommendation?
I would say recognizing TFW's education or degrees and master's degrees and PhDs, wherever it is that they hold, back home. I know, that might take a while, but, recognizing that their level of degrees, level of education, because a lot of temporary foreign workers, they have gone to schools 4 years, 6 years, even 10 years sometimes, and they can't practice what they're practicing here because the education system is different. And so therefore, if they wanted to practice, they have to start over again. They have to start from right at the beginning, and they have to go to school, and school is expensive here as an international student, right? So, and as an example of that, my mom is actually a midwife back home in the Philippines, and she wanted to practice midwifery here, but she said, I can't, because I have to work and I have to send money back home. So because she didn't have that opportunity to maybe have some of her courses recognized. I'm not saying like overall have it all recognized. I would suggest that have some of them recognized, that they don't have to start from the beginning.
Excellent. I think those are both those are meaningful and concrete recommendations. And I think my recommendation on the temporary foreign worker one specifically is a resumption of like a genuine system for assessing if the work of a foreign worker is required. Obviously here we are real advocates for immigration. I want people to be able to have the kind of lives that they want in Canada, but I don't want people being sold bill of goods, basically, where they believe that they're on a guaranteed path to permanent residency, and what they're really on the path to is 8 to 10 years of indentured servitude, which maybe ends in PR and maybe doesn't. And I think when I hear about the politicking and the anxieties and the concerns around immigration in this country, I think unfortunately a lot of it is attached to the fact that employers are bringing people in, paying them minimum wage or often less. Let's make sure that that's clear. Like it's really exploitative system. And then what happens as a consequence of that? So that would be my kind of thought on that. In the chat, we have a suggestion: a clear path to permanent residency for everyone. I like the idea of it being a rules-based system. If you can demonstrate that you have X, Y, Z, and Q, then you can be a permanent resident. I think that would cut a lot of the nonsense. And no more distinction between skills. So presumably labor classes and job classes. So thank you. My other question then, taking us a little earlier in the conversation, if we had a policy change or recommendation about asylum seekers in this country, what would be your suggestion? So I'll start with you, Jereecah. What would you change?
Again, that information piece is crucial for a lot of asylum seekers, where if they were to come here, at the port of entry right there and then, to be given the information that they need, especially with the legal aspect of that, because it's rigorous process, and it takes about 18 to 2 years for them to for IRB to even review their applications, and within those 18 months to 2 years, they have to know what to be doing. They can't just be sitting around and waiting for the IRB interview. They have to be preparing intently and saving all the newspaper clippings that they have back home and translating all of that, and even knowing how to hire a lawyer for that, because that's going to cost money as well. So those information has to be given, and they have to be prepared for what is going to come to for them once they go through that hearing.
And how about you, Addie? What would you change?
For me, I would say diligence in picking cases. It doesn't matter if it's refugee seekers, refugees through the United Nations, and time and how they process the security screening. Because to me, I don't know why, but like why we have to ask people when they're already in Canada, are you a terrorist? Do you plan to do something against the government? Those screenings should be before coming to the country.
Excellent. I agree. I think it's a really interesting issue about that whole processing piece. And I mean, maybe a little bit controversial, but I wonder about, we have in this country a constitutional ruling that criminal cases have to be seen within a fixed amount of time. Now, my younger sister is a lawyer. This has caused immeasurable challenges because we have a real deficit of, we don't have enough judges in this country, apparently. But we have a timeline that says, because of the significance of timeliness to justice, we have to have the resolution of this criminal matter in this long of a time. And I think on the asylum seeker case, I think that that's something that would be very meaningful to say, we can give you a decision. Maybe you're not necessarily going to be guaranteed that you're going to be given refugee status, but we can give you a decision either way within this period of time. I think that would allow a lot of service providers to provide services sort of more adequately. I think we would end up with people getting less entrenched in cycles of poverty, because they would, it's like it's 12 or 18 months and then you have a decision and you can go on with your life. To me, I think that that's an administrative problem, which I believe we have the ability to solve. I think it's a logistical, it would cost some money, everything always does. But I think that is a solvable problem in a way that sometimes, other pieces are more challenging to do. So thank you guys. Now, I know we're coming near to the end of our time here. And so I'll put two things out. First of all, if you are a listener, love if you have any other questions you'd like to throw in the chat, we can answer them. And then to my two co-panelists, because I always love to put this, is there anything you'd like to say on this topic that you haven't had the chance to say yet today? Anything that comes to mind particularly?
I just want to say that we work on this field, so we're accustomed to hear stories, but to everybody, it's not normal that we hear the struggles every day, and there's nothing that we can do sometimes. So it's very hard. So just be open-minded when you hear about temporary workers or refugees. We don't know their backstories. Mm-hmm. Be welcoming and inclusive to those people.
Fantastic. Love it. How about you, Jereecah?
Yeah, being welcoming and inclusive, and also being helpful as well too. Like to some of the listeners here, some of the stories that we talked about might be your first time hearing them. And now that know that these things are real, these things are happening in your community, in smaller communities as well. And to educate yourself is great to understand why it's happening, what can we do about it as well. And in the comment, I actually read a question where, what are the recommendations that you have for policymakers or employers in the community to enhance the system? And I would say to extensively work with settlement work agencies, where these are the front lines. They know these things and they see this every single day. So ask them about what are the changes we should be doing or making, because as I said, they have the experiences and they go through it with the families and with students, frontline in person.
Absolutely. I would echo those statements. I think we have an ability to, we have a real ability to be empathetic in these contexts and have that understanding. There's a question which is, a lot of people don't know these stories. Do you think the apathy around this issue is due to ignorance? And I would say yes. I think, no country is perfect, of course, and I think there's plenty of reasonable concerns for people to raise about the way that migrants and immigrants are treated in Canada. And maybe it's naive of me to say, but I really believe that if people were armed with this type of information, that I think they would be quite distressed at what they hear. I think that this issue around temporary residents and asylum seekers and so on, even, again, the fact that the media seems to have a hard time distinguishing between an asylum seeker and a refugee, it becomes part of a wider mix of people not understanding, having challenges in putting the pieces together because I thought that, Syrian refugees were able to get this, that, and the other. I thought they were getting special services. Why are you telling me that these people are not getting services? I think the ability to be specific and to say, what is it really that we're seeing here? One of the things that we haven't really touched on in this conversation, but I think it's important to mention, temporary foreign workers themselves and asylum seekers themselves are often terribly, terribly frightened to disclose any of this information. In one of the cases that we supported earlier this year, I think it took us almost 3 months to get the whole story out of a family that we were supporting. And in that case, it was police involved. The employer was arrested. It was very, very severe abuse. But because people are so frightened of being deported or being punished or suffering, they don't have that awareness of how can I tell this story? Will anybody listen to me? Will something bad happen to me if I don't if I tell the truth about this? And so I agree. I think this is a chance to kind of elevate those stories, to make people aware of what's going on, and hopefully, I am maybe I guess I am a belligerent optimist. I think these are systems that were put in place that can be changed. They can be altered. I have worked in policy myself. It takes a hell of a long time, but you can get things done. And so I really believe this is something that's changeable, and that's my hope. So yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to flag. I can see that, Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to copy your email and I'm going to send you the information that you need about CFP, because if I have to suffer through writing all those proposals, everybody else who's interested should be working on them. Any other final things? I know, again, we're almost at the end here. Any other questions that anyone has? Or anything else that people want to share, I suppose?
Well, Nexi Alarcon says, what are agencies doing to share the stories? We try to talk to each other when we have something going on.
It's a good point. We try to talk to each other. If you're me, sometimes you're like, hey, what's going on in the community? And then you pull a panel together. That's one of the options we have at our disposal. Any other how else do we share? Part of the challenge is that a lot of settlement agencies don't necessarily work with temporary residents. There's a couple of, most often people who are doing SWIS have a bit more latitude to work with temporary residents because of how they present in schools. There are some organizations that have provincial funding to support temporary residents. But oftentimes it's not front and center because people it's not their core mandate. And so that it is not always made aware. Maybe Jereecah, anything you wanted to mention about sharing stories?
In terms of sharing stories, so within specifically our role, a lot of times we are also, we do a lot of advocacy for our families and students and parents. So oftentimes even going into schools with them, and explaining that piece where sometimes with schools, they don't really understand the immigration stories and what some of these families have to go through. And going to schools and even sometimes going to appointments with them as well too, where they need that language piece, and sharing their stories as well, because a lot of times sometimes we don't think about it's mundane things where we go into appointments. We don't think about the fact that there are some families where these are difficult things to do. They're not easy things to do because of the language barrier. But for us, because we've done it so many times, because it's part of our lives, it's easy for us. But there are lots and lots of families there that are struggling with English and don't know how to communicate. So we do a lot of that part where we're always with them on what they're doing in the community to introduce them or to walk them through the whole process.
Yeah, and for me, sometimes it's that piece. When you talk to somebody who knows exactly what you deal with, and sometimes it's just to find answers because you deal with that, like you say, we have that precedent, right? So if I never encounter that, you might have the answer what you did to ensure that that person was taken care of, and then I just mirror what you guys did. So it's nice to have that communication with other agencies.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, what I really hope coming out of this discussion today is that those of you who've taken the time, also thank you to everybody who's taken the time to be here tonight. It is a Sunday night. And so I really appreciate you sitting at your computers, sitting at your iPads, whatever, wherever you find yourself, for sitting here, for listening, for your thoughtful questions. It is my great pleasure to bring the expertise of my co-panelists to you. I think this is a story that we have a responsibility to tell. I feel like this is going to be one time among many that we're going to continue to tell it, but I really want to thank my co-panelists for taking the time to be here on a Sunday night as well. Much appreciated. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen and to be here this evening. I really believe if a policy doesn't work, we can change it. I've ripped up lots of policies in the past. They were mostly about printers and things, but like, it's doable. And so I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here today. And I think, as they say, look, we can give you maybe 5 minutes back in your evening if that sounds good to everyone. So thank you very much for being here. I really, really appreciate it.